Good morning. I'm Julie Carlson, the Associate Director of the Schumpeter Project at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Welcome to the latest installment of ITIF's Dynamic Antitrust Discussion Series. In recent years, anti-monopoly advocates, economics Nobel laureates, members of Congress, and many in the media have advanced a narrative that there has been a dangerous increase in market concentration across the United States economy. Paul Krugman wrote that growing monopoly power is a big problem for the US economy. Joe Stiglitz wrote that a deeper and more fundamental problem is the growing concentration of market power. The neo-Brandeisian advocacy group Open Markets often refers to America's concentration crisis, and the Center for American Progress has written about America's monopoly problem. Senator Amy Klobuchar, chairwoman of the Senate Subcommittee on Competition Policy, Antitrust, and Consumer Rights, has written that we are seeing higher levels of market concentration across our economy, partially driven by waves of corporate consolidation. Congressman David Cicilline, chairman of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, warns that America has a monopoly problem. Federal Trade Commission Chair Lena Khan claims we are facing a sweeping market power problem as a result of relaxing antitrust law. This alleged increase in concentration is blamed for numerous economic woes, including slower productivity growth, stagnant wages, less business dynamism, and most recently, higher inflation. Proponents of this narrative cite lax antitrust enforcement as the cause for increased concentration and call for radical changes to antitrust enforcement and law. In 2017, former DOJ Antitrust Division Chief Economist Carl Shapiro summed up this view by saying, somehow, over the past 2 years, the notion that there has been a substantial and widespread decline in competition throughout the American economy has taken root in the popular press. In some circles, this is now the conventional wisdom, the starting point for policy analysis, rather than a bold hypothesis that needs to be tested. Well, this morning we'll test that hypothesis. Our panelists will discuss what basis there is for the narrative of increased concentration and whether there really has been a significant increase. On our panel this morning, we have Robert Atkinson, who is the president of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, Gregory Werden, former senior economic counsel in the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, and Nicholas Trachter, senior economist and research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Each of our panelists will discuss their work on concentration in the United States economy, and that'll be followed up by some discussion and questions. So we'll get our panel kicked off this morning with Rob.
Hey, thank you so much, Julie. It's really a pleasure to be here with yourself and two great panelists. So I want to start off with a great quote from Patrick Moynihan, former senator from New York, who famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." The problem with the antitrust and concentration debate is it's largely fact-free, and the folks that Julie alluded to are largely opining. They're not really basing it on any facts, and actually facts matter. So what I want to talk about is a report that ITIF released last summer, where we looked at the US Census Bureau data. The economic census comes out every 5 years. It takes them a little while to get all the data together, and it takes them even longer to get the concentration data together. But those data were released, I think, early last year, early 2021, and we now analyze them, and I want to talk about that. Couple of caveats. There's no question that definitions of relevant market are debatable. It's difficult to measure market power. Competition can differ at local and state levels and national levels. Absolutely correct. But one, at least, window into what's happening in the economy in concentration and monopoly, quote unquote monopoly, is to look at what are called concentration ratios. And what that is, essentially at the most disaggregated level, the Census Bureau collects data on what are called 6-digit NAICS codes, very fine-grained, the finest grained industries. There's about 850 that they have, and so things like tortilla manufacturing. So it's not all bread manufacturing, it's actually tortilla manufacturing, would be a 6-digit NAICS code. We were able to get data that is comparable to 2002 using, again, the same census data in 2017. One of the problems, and I know Greg may make this point, others make this point as well, that maybe concentration went up in earlier periods, maybe a little bit more. That may be, but it's hard. The farther you go back, the harder it is to get comparable data, because the definition of NAICS codes changes over time, and you can't. It's hard to get apples to apples. So, what we looked at ITIF were what's called the C4 concentration ratio between 2002 and 2017 for over 850 industries. And what the C4 concentration ratio is census lists for each of these industries. What's the top, the 4 companies in each industry that have the most sales? What share of sales do they have? How much sales do they have as a share of total sales? So that's called the C4. The C8 would be the top 8. The C20 would be the top 20, et cetera. And so the C4 ratios essentially are trying to measure concentration by how much these firms have market share. There's another measure called the HHI, and that's a little bit different in the sense of it weights the top one different than the third or the second, and it gives more weight to like if the top one has a lot more concentration. The problem is HHI is not available for all of the economy. It's only available for manufacturing. There was a new study that was released by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I believe last week. It was done for them by NERA Economic Consulting, and it actually did analyze the HHI in manufacturing. And it was very interesting. What it found was that the HHI declined significantly. So it went from 821 HHI points in 2007 down to 619 in 2017. So anybody who says overall manufacturing concentration has gone up, it certainly is not the case since 2007. And then they went back to 2002 and essentially found no change between 2002 and 2017. What about C4? They did their own analysis, very similar to ours, and they came up with pretty much the exact same finding. They found that C4, average C4 across all of these 800 plus industries fell from 36.9% in 2007 to 35.2% in 2017. And if you go back to 2002, there was essentially no change. So in summary, when you look at all of these industries from 2002 to 2017, there's just simply no change in C4. We did our own analysis. We found there was 1 percentage point increase in C4, so very similar, from about 32 to 33. So you think about that, that means that the average industry in the US has, the top 4 firms have 8% of the market, not very concentrated. If you look at just 2017 and you look at just counting up all of the industries, you find that 640 have a C4 of under 50%, 173 below 80, and only 35 industries above 80%. I talk a little bit more about what those are. So most industries in the US are actually quite unconcentrated. And then if you look at the change in concentration, what you find is that most industries fell. A lot of industries fell. So about 370 industries actually saw declining C4, so they became less concentrated. And about 460 saw increases. But overall, the increases were not all that significant. One of the problems with the debate is that a lot of people, like for example, The Economist has said this, and others, they'll say a lot of industries saw increases in concentration. The problem is that really doesn't mean anything, because if an industry is at C8 and it goes to C12, that's a 50% increase in concentration, but there's no real market problem there with you have a C4 of 12. Now, the other thing we did is we said, what's the relationship between a C4 the C4 in 2002 and the C4 in 2017? In other words, you put all those industries together and you just do a simple correlation coefficient. And what you find is that it's actually negative. So it's negative 0.23. So the more concentrated an industry was in 2002, the more it became unconcentrated in 2017. So the concentrated industries became less concentrated over that period of time. You find, and then if we look at, well, let's just, the argument is, well, okay, maybe the neo-Brandeisians will say, well, these industries that are not concentrated, like barbershops, okay, fine, we'll give you that one. But what about these really concentrated ones? So if you look at the most concentrated industries, what generally economists would say is C4 of above 60%, in other words, each firm having 12.5%, that maybe there's some concentration issues there. What you find is that more, again, is the same data I said before, 39 industries actually who had a C4 above 60 in 2020. So in other words, in 2002, industries that were pretty concentrated in 2002, 39 of those saw a decline in their C4 ratio of 10 percentage points or more. And only 15 saw an increase of 10 percentage points or more. So again, the data do not advance the notion that there's this huge monopoly problem. Another case people will make, well, what about tech industries? We all hear about Google or maybe Amazon, even though Amazon's not even the top 4 retailers in the US. So let's look at advanced tech. If you look at advanced tech industries as defined by the Brookings Institution, what you found is that the number of highly concentrated tech industries fell by half, from 10.6% of those industries to 4.7%. The number of unconcentrated industries with low concentration increased from 62% to 81%. So even in the tech sector, what you find is that these industries are becoming less concentrated. What about prices? I mean, clearly we should see a relationship between concentration and prices. This is the whole argument, that these monopolists are using their market power to raise prices and raise profits. It's hard to get exactly comparable data just because the BLS Producer Price Index doesn't cover a lot of industries. But looking at the 36 industries that have a C4 of over 70% in 2002, so the most concentrated industries, the BLS found that the Producer Price Index increases were actually lower than the overall Producer Price Index. So in other words, these most concentrated industries raise their prices less than the overall economy. So again, on the face of it, that doesn't suggest that these companies have market power, at least in terms of pricing, or that if they do, that they're not using it. In fact, that correlation was negative 0.31. And lastly, what about profitability? This is something that the neo-Brandeisians push. These companies are making obscene profits. ITIF has done another series of reports in the recent past called Monopoly Myths. And so we looked at this question of profits. And when you look at profits, if you look at non-financial domestic profits, which is really the key thing, we don't care about overseas profits. The higher the overseas profits are, the better we all are on Americans, is because a lot of us own stock or pension funds or the like. That's their monopoly problem in another country if American companies are making high profits. So looking only at domestic profits in the US and non-financial, you find that they have not increased. They're the same they were as 30, 40 years ago. So that we found the exact same thing when we compared IRS data. So again, IRS is only at the 3-digit level. We could get 80 industries. So we compared profitability data with concentration data. Essentially, the correlation coefficient is 0.04. So in other words, just no correlation between concentration and profits. So let me just stop there with the conclusion being, anybody who wants to make the claim that monopoly has increased dramatically, and when they say that, they don't mean in the 80s and 90s, which maybe Greg can talk about. What they mean is in the last 2 decades, in the last 10 years. If they're going to make that claim, they need to show evidence, not just make claims and then use that to advance a fairly draconian, backward-looking antitrust agenda. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Next up, we'll hear from Greg.
Thank you. Increasing concentration at the market level is an urban myth. Before elaborating that proposition, I want to quickly review some history, because we're now in the fourth cycle of public concern about increasing concentration, and each differs from the others in important ways. The first cycle involved the appearance of the first giant industrial corporations, and concentration really increased. We went from atomistic industries to industries, in some cases, dominated by some giant company. And concentration was a political issue in the late 1880s, and it resulted in antitrust law, including the Sherman Act of 1890, which was not the first. A bunch of states preceded it, as did Canada. But fear and loathing of these giant companies is what produced antitrust law in the first place. But these first generation laws prohibited cartels, but not mergers. And antitrust law helped precipitate a great merger wave around the turn of the 20th century. Partly as a result of that, antitrust became a grassroots political issue in 1899, and it remained so for 15 years. There were two major antitrust conferences in Chicago, and I brought for show and tell today the delegate's badge for the 1890 conference. It's a rare artifact. I don't have the one for the 1899 conference. Moving on. Antitrust remained a political issue, and by some accounts was the biggest issue in the 1912 election, where incumbent William Howard Taft came in third because the American tobacco and Standard Oil cases were seen as failures by the electorate. This led to the Clayton and FTC Acts, and they were followed by the second great merger wave, which lasted until the 1929 stock market crash. This time the response, and was at the highest level, the President of the United States, was just to study the problem. And one of the results was industrial organization economics flourished. I will return to that shortly. The United States didn't get a real anti-merger law until 1950, but by the mid-1960s, horizontal mergers had been declared nearly per se illegal by the courts. A third merger wave followed, but this time it was conglomerate mergers. They didn't increase concentration, except what was called aggregate concentration. But some people were afraid of that, and they predicted dire consequences, but nothing happened. In fact, aggregate concentration has really stayed pretty much the same for the last 50 years. Merger enforcement loosened up in the mid-1980s, and several studies of different periods since then have asserted a substantial increase in concentration. I will get back to some of the studies that have garnered publicity. But first, I want to go back to the 1930s and trace the development of concentration data very briefly. In the late 1930s, U.S. government economist Gardner C. Means led the first systematic study of industrial concentration, working with the U.S. Bureau of Census. And that study pioneered the four-firm concentration ratio, about which we just heard a little bit. At the same time, the Census Bureau was developing the standard industrial classification for compiling economic data. The first published concentration ratios for SIC four-digit manufacturing industries were for the year 1947. And for about 3 decades, these data from the census were the mainstay of empirical research in industrial organization. In the 1960s and 1970s, every student of industrial organization learned that SIC data had substantial limitations, and most stemmed from the fact that the census defined industries from the supply side. When the hypothetical monopolist test for markets was introduced around 1980, the import of these limitations became clearer because relevant markets in antitrust cases were defined exclusively from the demand side. 3 decades ago, I published 2 rarely cited articles that showed that SIC 4-digit manufacturing industries were more than 100 times the scope of most criminally prosecuted cartels and most relevant markets in merger complaints. Recent claims of increasing concentration have not been made by industrial organization economists. They were made by people trained in various fields: labor economics, macroeconomics, finance, and journalism. The Economist was the first to get in print, and in one respect, its study was better than most because The Economist used the least aggregated census data. We just heard about these 6-digit data from the census, which are the closest that the census has to the market level. The 6-digit industries in the current North American Industry Classification System, NAICS, are slightly broader than the SIC 4-digit industries that we used to use. When I critiqued claims of increasing concentration in 2018, I compared 6-digit industries to the relevant markets that had been alleged in Justice Department merger cases during fiscal years 2013 through 15. For most of the alleged relevant markets, the NAICS 6-digit industry was at least 200 times the scope of the relevant market alleged by the Justice Department. Now, the claims of increasing concentration mostly have relied on data aggregated much more highly than the 6-digit industries. The 2016 report of the Council of Economic Advisors employed data at the sector level. The NAICS has 53 times as many 6-digit industries as it has sectors. The CEA found that concentration increased the most in the retail, trade, and transportation sectors. But both of these sectors contain many distinct product markets, and most of those product markets contain many distinct geographic markets. What you realize when you see concentration going up at the sector level is that what we're seeing is the effect of what were once called product extension and market extension mergers. These are mergers of firms that are not in the same relevant market. They're not horizontal mergers, but they're in related markets, maybe different geographies. These mergers can generate significant efficiencies. They don't increase market concentration, which is why they were allowed to happen under antitrust law. The most widely cited claim by an academic of increasing concentration appeared in a finance journal and is typical of finance research. It relied on firm data rather than census data. The authors constructed their own concentration data at the subsector level, which was also used by several other academic studies. With more than 10 6-digit industries per subsector, a subsector is apt to have a scope of more than 1,000 times that of a relevant market. This excessive aggregation causes concentration trends to be meaningless. Consider an industry consisting of 5 distinct relevant markets, and assume the industry experienced a great merger wave in which 25 equal-sized firms became 5 equal-sized firms. Now, if none of the mergers was horizontal, which is possible, all of the market HHIs remained at 2,000. If all of the mergers were horizontal, also possible, all of the market HHIs increased to 10,000. Whatever the truth at the market level, the industry data showed that concentration increased from an HHI of 400 to an HHI of 2,000, whether it increased or not. In a forthcoming book chapter, now available on SSRN, I present a series of hypotheticals, and they generate pseudo data through various processes that involve mergers or other dynamics in industries, industries growing, shrinking, things like that. And they show a lot of ways you get trends in the aggregated data without any trends in the disaggregated data. My chapter also talks about how the firm level data introduces its own bias. And this is because of the way it's constructed. Firms are assigned industries based on the plurality of their operations. So if two non-competing firms merge, that's going to cause an increase in observed concentration in two industries when it actually goes up in none. The larger merging firm is going to inherit the data of the smaller merging firm. So concentration in its assigned industry goes up because it seems to get bigger. The data for the industry of the smaller merging firm will show an increase in concentration because that firm disappears from the data. But there is no increase in concentration. And my chapter constructs a more complicated hypothetical that doesn't involve excessive aggregation at all. I hypothesize the formation of a conglomerate that acquires a firm in every market of an economy that has only 10 markets. In my example, there is one horizontal merger in this series of mergers. So the average HHI at the market level does go up, but only 4%. But measured in this firm data, the average HHI across the entire economy goes up by a whopping 79%, just as an artifact of the way firm data are put together to build these concentration indexes. So my bottom line is that the published studies that have gotten all the publicity are of no value whatever in trying to understand what is happening at the relevant level of the economy, the market level. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. That was really great to get those examples. We'll now turn to Nicholas.
Hi, thank you, Julie. I'm going to share my slides. So let me just start by saying that the views I will share today are just my views and do not represent necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So typically we care about market power, okay? And this is important for all of us because it affects the level of markups, it affects how shocks pass through to prices, and it affects how we think about how to distribute profits, okay, or revenue into firms and people, okay? The problem is that measuring market power is hard, and thus typically we resort to evidence. Now, in terms of evidence, the typical measure that people use, we all use, is industry concentration. So what I will show today is the importance of geography and the growth of large firms in explaining industry concentration. So I will base this discussion on a paper we wrote a few years ago with Esteban Rossi Hansberg, now at U Chicago, and Pierre Sarti, also at Richmond Fed with me. That is called Diverging Trends in National and Local Concentration. Okay, so what is the idea? So typically, concentration measures are produced at the national level. And when you do that, you're implicitly assuming that firms are competing with each other at the national level. When you do that, when you find the data, the typical result is that you see an increase in concentration. What we will do is recompute everything at local levels by industry and then aggregate up, okay? Now, this measure makes more sense for industries where competition is local. Think about retail, services, and any other industry with high transport costs. For example, think about hot coffee. If you want to buy hot coffee here in Chicago, if you buy it in LA, it will be very costly to ship it to Chicago while it remains hot. Now, when you do this type of exercise, market concentration actually decreases, not increases. So we resort to this data that's called nets. They're similar to the census data that give us data for every industry in the US, for every firm, and every store they have across space in the country, and at very disaggregated level. It's called SIC8. It's even more than X6. So it's very, very narrow industries. Okay. So what is this plot? Okay, we have data by year, and we compute the HHI, but everything I will show you today applies for other measures of concentration. So the blue line is you compute concentration by industry at the national level and aggregate across industries using the weights of each industry. And what you find is what everybody else finds is that concentration typically increases at the national level. When you do the same, but at local levels, you see a different picture. Okay. In particular, for example, you think about industries to compete at the local level, say zip codes, concentration is actually decreasing through time. Okay. Now, this divergence of local and national concentration is more extreme in local industries. Okay. So this plot is the following. I will restrict attention to national concentration and zip code concentration measures. Okay. And I will look at them across major industries. Okay, so manufacturing is blue, and this one here, wholesale trade, retail trade, fire, that is kind of banking and financial services, and then services. And what you can see in this plot is that the greatest divergence happens for retail, fire, and services, and the smallest degree of divergence happens for industries within manufacturing and wholesale trade. Okay. Now, with this measure, okay, there's a vast amount of heterogeneity across industries. I'm going to divide industries by diverging patterns. So I will call a diverging industry an industry where national concentration goes up and local concentration goes down. And a non-diverging industry, an industry where national concentration goes up and local concentration goes up too. Okay? So the left plot is for diverging industries. The right plot, the one in blue, is for non-diverging industries. And I want to study what happens with concentration when I remove for each industry the top firm in that industry. Okay, so let me start with the plot on the left. Okay, orange line, just solid orange line, it's just a concentration measure I showed you before at the national level for diverging industries, and it's going up. Okay, now when I remove the top firms in each industry, national concentration is lower. It's increasing but less. So this is consistent with the story that big firms are becoming bigger. Okay. Now, what happens at the local level? Well, the local level, the red solid line is the local concentration for divergent industries is going down. When I remove the large firms in each industry, actually concentration measure goes down, but by less. So in some sense, these large firms are actually aiding to a decrease in concentration at the local level. Notice that this pattern does not happen for the non-divergent industries, where if I remove the big firms, concentration goes down both at the national and local levels. So what is going on? So what happens when a top firm comes to town? Okay, so with this data, what we do is the following now. For divergent industries on the left plot and non-divergent industries in the right plot, we go and see the first time a top national firm in an industry goes to a town or a small location. And we see what happens with concentration in that place. Okay? So time zero, okay, is the moment in a location where an industry where this big firm, okay, enters the local market. So before there was not this big firm in the local market, after that, you see that firm. So what do you see? And this is the concentration measure, the change in the concentration measure. So this some concentration, the top firms comes in, concentration falls because now there's one more firm, one more plant in that location. So naturally that decreases concentration, and then concentration stays down for at least 7 years. If we look at non-divergent industries, this is not the case. When the firm enters, there's a falling concentration, but then the falling concentration only remains around for around 4 years, and eventually concentration picks up. Okay, so what is the key? So at the local level, in some sense, where these large firms are expanding geographically, this is aiding to competition in local markets. Imagine that before there were some small stores there competing with each other, but they were mostly kind of monopolies in some sense. And now these big firms comes in and start competing with these other firms. Now, the smaller firms typically shrink. So the new big guy that comes in kind of is the biggest guy now, but typically remain in the market. They don't exit. This is what this plot shows. Some exit though, but not a lot of them. So in some sense, the idea is that these top firms have a pro-competitive effect at the local market. Anyways, that's all I had to share with you today. And thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Nicholas. So we'll join our whole panel back together now. That was all super interesting, and I thought really counter to the narrative that we're hearing. So just to sort of kick off some questions. So a lot of you have talked about these NAICS codes. So proponents of this narrative that concentration increased use NAICS codes to advance their claims, but we're seeing through the studies that you all have done that that these NAICS codes actually show that concentration isn't increasing, and then they'll say, well, the NAICS codes aren't the relevant measure. So how should we respond to those criticisms? I don't know, Rob, if you want to take that to get us started.
Well, I think there's two things that are going on. One is there, like the Economist article and several others, they make a claim that you see a lot of increases, a lot of NAICS codes where there's an increase in concentration, and that gets sort of endlessly repeated. That there's a lot of industries going up in concentration. And the problem with that is it matters what the HHI is, or the C4 or the C8 to start with. And so, you know, there are a lot of industries that have gone from 6 to 8 or 6 to 12 or 6 to 16. And the question is, who cares? What difference does that make? So part of it is that even when these groups use data, they intentionally misinterpret what's going on there. So in other words, there's no reason to believe that an industry where the top 4 firms have 12% of the market is a problem. So they look at they report increases, and that makes it look worse. The second thing is a lot of these folks simply just don't have any evidence. It's like one of those things in a school classroom where you repeat the thing long enough. They just keep repeating this over and over again. It's become conventional wisdom. We all know that monopoly is a crisis. I mean, this is the terms that people like Krugman, who should know better, use, and elected officials use. I understand why elected officials use it. I mean, if you're trying to push fairly draconian changes in our antitrust law, you don't want to be constrained by actual evidence. So you're going to want to push your case as much as possible. So I get that, but what I don't get is why the media just repeats this ad nauseum. At minimum, they should say, you know, I get Greg's point about NAICS codes. I get it. I'm not denying that. But the fact that the NAICS codes themselves just don't support that narrative, the neo-Brandeisian narrative, and actually rebut it, that ought to count for something in the debate. I mean, at least something. I mean, why doesn't Tim Wu say this once in a while?
Yeah.
Let me underscore the point that Rob just made about the fact that the stress is all placed on the number of industries where concentration goes up without regard to how low it is. So it would be very easy to construct a hypothetical data set in which concentration in a bunch of very low concentration industries increased a lot, but it stayed really low. Remember, they're calculating a percentage. So if the HHI goes from 100 to 500, that's a 5,000% increase in concentration. But concentration is still really low. And you average that out over the whole economy, and a whole bunch of unconcentrated industries can drive the average. Should only be looking at industries where concentration is enough that we might care. And people aren't doing that exercise.
Yeah. So, Greg, I know you alluded to this a little bit in your opening remarks about just how misspecified NAICS codes are in terms of relevant product markets that we care about in terms of antitrust enforcement. I don't know if you could elaborate that on a little bit more, given your experience at the Justice Department, just like how how different these NAICS codes are. Like what are they measuring compared to sort of what antitrust authorities typically are looking at when they're engaged in merger review?
Okay. I started doing merger work at the Department of Justice in 1977. And very shortly thereafter, under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, companies started having to file data before their mergers could take place in this pre-merger review. And the data they were required to file was the data that they had provided the census based on 4-digit SIC industries. It's now NAICS 6-digit industries, but then it was SIC 4-digit industries. And I don't remember a single case where anybody paid any attention to those data. There had to be some, but I can't remember one. And why not? Well, mainly because in, something like 98, 99% of the cases, we're looking at something vastly narrower than the census industry. Not every time, but in the vast majority of cases. And in the manufacturing sector, where the geographic markets are mostly fairly big, there basically aren't any local markets. There are some regional markets, but most of the markets are national or international. The issue is just the scope of the product market. But you look at those, and each of these 6-digit industries has thousands or tens of thousands of products in them. And in some cases, we would put a whole bunch of products together in the antitrust analysis. But in most cases, it would just be a tiny slice. And if you look at a sample of merger complaints, you're going to find a whole bunch of merger complaints alleging markets of things that you can't even find in the NAICS because they're too minor to even mention. In the detailed descriptions of what's in the codes, you just don't find it. It is in there somewhere. Everything is in there. But it's just a tiny, tiny slice of the economy. And it bears no relation to the NAICS data, which has another interesting implication, which is that the agencies find a lot of markets that are much more concentrated than what you see in the NAICS data. Because once they get much, much narrower, they can get much, much more concentrated. They don't necessarily, but they frequently do.
That's helpful. I want to turn to what I think of sort of as the elephant in the room and talk a little bit about Amazon. And you often hear reported that, the majority of consumers start their search for products on Amazon. And I was just wondering, Nicholas, if you could maybe talk a little bit about how sort of online retail sort of figures in to sort of how we think about some of these concentration studies, right? So at least my understanding of the NAICS codes, right, is that they would classify Amazon in a separate NAICS code, right? There's like some online retailing mail order category, right, in the codes. No. But no, they don't classify them there.
No, before Nicholas talks, let me give a little background on how the census works. So the economic census was modeled on the population census. And we all know how that works. It counts people, and it counts them at an address. So that's exactly what the economic census does. It counts economic entities at an address. So every Amazon warehouse is what's called an establishment in the census, and Amazon's offices are establishments. They're not in the same business. I assume, without knowing, that the warehouses are all in the wholesale trade business. They could consider them retail trade, but I think it's wholesale. Okay. But that's the unit at which data is observed.
Okay. So, I think still, I think sort of still speaks to the point that I wanted to raise or ask about, is that, I sort of, think of Amazon as participating in every local geographic market, right? And so to the extent that that's not being picked up by the way that the census is is capturing Amazon sales, or how does that kind of influence the results that you see in your study, and just how should we think about that more generally, I guess?
Hi, Julie. No, that's a good question. And I think also it relates to what you were asking before. I want to make just two comments. One is, I think Greg said this correctly in my mind, is that at the end of the day, when I buy something from Amazon, it shifts to me from some establishment, okay, like some place, and that place is a location in this data, and it will be assigned to some industry, whatever it is. Okay, so in some sense, it's in the data there. So the fact that I go online and buy it online is in some sense irrelevant with the idea that it's shipped to me from somewhere, and it will be assigned to a location. Okay. Of course, then it's true that you go online, in some sense, it competes with other online retailers, and that makes things more iffy. The other thing I think is very real that you pointed out, Julie, is this dichotomy between thinking about industries versus products. Okay, and well, I mean, we may want to decide to look at competition within products instead of industries, but then, and that's fine, and that's not say what I did, for example. So you might think that the cereal company is competing in a supermarket versus another cereal company in another supermarket, but you can also think that actually supermarkets are competing with each other, right? And because they provide different services, it's not the same a toy store selling toys that a supermarket selling toys. Okay, so both of them have some validity, and both of them gives you different kind of insights. I think typically, as far as I know, research tends to find that measures are kind of consistent, that concentration at local levels are decreasing, with some few that find different things. But yeah, so I think the thing of online retailing is kind of complicated, and I think hopefully we'll learn more in the future about it.
So I guess, should we think about the effect of online retailing? Should that make us more or less skeptical about this argument that concentration is increasing?
Well, it says we can't take the data at face value, and we got to work a little harder if we want to get anything out of it. It's really an old problem, because back in the olden days, when we had the old economy based on manufacturing, and that's all that economists looked at, we still had a problem that was the same conceptually: imports. So there were some manufacturing industries, even way back when, more than 50 years ago, where imports were very important. And industrial organization economists either threw out the industries that imports were important in when they did the research, or they tried to make adjustments based on data that we have on imports. And of course, imports have gotten much bigger in manufacturing. So the manufacturing data from the census are much less useful than they used to be. And now we have this whole new economy, a lot of it related to the internet. And we have a lot of industries where, in order to do business, one had to have a physical establishment in the olden days, and now one doesn't have to, like financial services. So I've been privy to a couple of conversations in the last 6 months about how should you do banking data now? And off the top of my head, not being an expert, my answer is, well, you have to make adjustments for the presence of internet financial institutions, and that's doable.
Okay. You sort of, go ahead, Rob.
Well, a couple of things. One is, I'm not sure how, my understanding is Amazon is classified as electronic sales, but Census collects data on two things, on establishments and on enterprises. And the C4 concentration data is on enterprises. It's not on establishments. So The establishment data is much more about things like, how many jobs are in Nebraska or something like that. That's point number one. Point number two is it, as always, has to go to the relevant market. There are a lot of things that I buy on Amazon that I might buy on Walmart instead, or I might go down to my local hardware store here in Bethesda and get it because it's more convenient. So the problem with how that market is defined is it's defined by the neo-Brandeisians as the electronic commerce retail market, which I think is way too, even within that, there's competition. It's way too narrow. It's the same thing as defining Facebook as the social media market, when really what the market should be is the ad market, number one, the online ad market, and even the ad market bigger broadly, but even more specifically, it should be the eyeball market. Every moment I'm on TikTok, which seems like a lot of moments these days, is a moment I'm not on Facebook, or a moment I'm not on Twitter. So I think the neo-Brandeisians wanted to define markets as narrowly as possible in order to inflate the concentration size.
Yeah.
I would just say that the antitrust agencies are going to define narrow markets also. And having been at one for 42 years, I can say I thought we were right to do so.
Well, Greg, I don't know. I mean, look, you and Julie have both been there, been at the FTC, but so there's a lot more than I did. But I thought when it was the Staples Office Depot merger that the market took into effect that companies like Walmart were selling these things. So there, the market was defined a little more broadly, which I think rightly so.
It was not.
Maybe I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I don't know about some of the later cases, but I know the early one was very narrow.
The FTC may have been wrong. The court may have been wrong, but the office supply superstores was the market
at that time. And I think this sort of raises an interesting point, right? That sort of these markets evolve over time. And I think this is something that you're all sort of alluding to with the way that these industry codes are defined, that they're not sort of taking into account how markets are evolving. We do have a question from the audience. I thought we'd jump to that. So any thoughts on the New York Fed study on the importance of foreign firms selling in the United States? That is, if foreign firms are included, then there is no increasing concentration. I know, Greg, you alluded to this a little bit with the import discussion. I don't know if others have thoughts.
I remember that I have looked at the study, but that's as much as I remember about it. This is kind of hard to do because the import data don't match up all that well with the census data. And I have never tried to match it up, although some industrial organization economists have done so. I don't think at the firm level we have the data. We have import data, and I don't know how you attribute it to firms. So I'm not exactly sure what the methodology of this study was. We certainly don't have firm level data for the massive amount of imports we get from China. But I have no difficulty believing that if we did have this data, that it would show something dramatically different from what the census data show, because the imports have grown over time. That is by and large unconcentrated. And what you can see potentially is that the census data show increasing concentration over time as U.S. firms exit an industry and are replaced by foreign firms. So that true concentration may be diminishing, even if census concentration shows it going up, because domestic production is becoming less and less important.
So a couple of things on that. One is, I believe that study used confidential data from census that at least I can't get. You have to be a certified analyst to be able to access individual firm records, and I think that's how they were able to get around this, Greg. But what they found in that study was that when you include imports, and they only studied manufacturing, that there's no it gets rid of any increase in concentration. It negates it. There was another study that we cited in that report we did last year. And I don't know all the others, but it's and I'm going to mispronounce it. Kovar bias. Kovar bias. And he and his colleagues found that from 1997 to 2012, that the C8 ratio for high import manufacturing went up 6.7%, but when you then adjust for imports, the rise was only 1.6%. So again, I think both these studies, that one and then the New York Fed one, find that imports are pretty significant in reducing the rise of concentration.
So we just have a few minutes left. So suppose you're all wrong. So suppose concentration has actually increased despite all this evidence that it hasn't. Should we be concerned?
I wouldn't be worried about it that much. There are many people who want to jump to the conclusion that increasing market concentration means we have a problem, and particularly an antitrust problem. And I don't think that's right at all. One of the things the old industrial organization literature taught us is that there's a natural tendency of markets to concentrate, even if all firms are created equal. This is just the result of Markov processes at random events. But if firms aren't all created equal, then we have a very strong tendency of markets to concentrate, because the better firms grow. The firms that have the lowest cost, that innovate the most, that have the best products, they grow relative to the others. The other ones may shrink and die, and you may get a very high concentration because some firms succeed and some firms don't. That's not a bad thing as long as everyone competes on the merits. The growth of the firms that have the lowest cost, that innovate the most, is the reward they get to their enterprise and excellence. And we should cheer that, even if it leads to monopoly, which it hardly ever does. But even if it does, that's part of competition. Someone will come along and displace that monopoly with a better product.
So I agree with Greg mostly. I have to say, given the fact that ITIF has the Schumpeter project, which Julie is associate director of that, I have to invoke the spirit of Schumpeter, which is there are good monopolies and there are bad monopolies, and there's good market power and bad market power. And if the market power that tends to accrue in technology companies is generally good market power. They use that to reinvest into the next generation of innovation. Market power when you have maybe two manufacturers merge, where you get, or two cell phone companies merge, where you get big economies of, you get scale effects, and you can get rid of a lot of redundancy. I know that the FTC now looks at those with horror. Oh my gosh, there were some labor savings going on. We must stop this. Labor savings are another word for productivity, and productivity is the core way that we raise living standards. So, again, I'm sure there are some mergers. I don't study hospitals, but I know FTC is worried about hospital mergers sometimes. If hospitals merge, it seems like maybe there isn't that many innovation benefits, but in these other areas, there's huge innovation benefits for scale. And I think we shouldn't forget that.
Okay, we've got about a minute left, so I guess any parting thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, other than my call is for people to read Greg and Nicholas's paper, and all the journalists out there to actually start looking at data.
So my last thing, I want to depart with this, is that I like Julie's last question about concentration and if you should worry about it if it's going up or down. I mean, at least I try to be very careful not to say anything about market power. This is our concentration. And then, of course, we need to understand the link between concentration and market power. It's not obvious. And if concentration is going up, it could go up for different reasons. It could go up because of proactive firms becoming bigger, as Greg was pointing out, that's good, potentially good, but it can be going up for other reasons that could be very bad. I mean, like, so research is all about understanding these reasons, and we will learn more about it eventually, I think, but we're not there yet.
Great. Greg, any last thoughts before we sign off?
Only that we always know less about things than people think we know. And the people who are convinced that we know the most are always wrong. The data are much more complicated and subtle than people realize until they spend a lot of time studying the data. And the internet amplifies the most strident voices so much that I'm afraid that reason suffers, and we may see some ill-advised new things coming out of Congress as a result of people in Congress reading only the headlines and not looking at the evidence.
So let me second that. I would encourage everybody to go and look at all the research that was discussed today. Really super interesting stuff, and a little bit head scratching as to how this narrative continues in spite of it. So thanks everyone. Really appreciate you participating in the panel today.
Thank you.